Hello everyone, welcome back to the Blockman editor tutorial. In these videos, we will give you a complete introduction to the Blockman editor. In this video, we will introduce the contents related to the entity trigger. Go to the editor and open the trigger edit interface of the entity. Here we can edit the entity triggers. Click the new button to add a trigger node. In the list, we can see that the entity has a lot of trigger nodes. This video will introduce several commonly used trigger nodes. Please try out the other trigger nodes in your own time. When the entity enters the game is triggered when an entity enters the game. It's often used to initialize the entity's data, or set the entity's properties or position. When the entity leaves the game is triggered when the player exits the game or the entity is destroyed. It's often used to save data when a player exits, or to send a global message for notification. When the entity dies is triggered when an entity is killed. It's often used to remove the equipment after the death of an entity, and to gain points after killing an entity. When the entity takes damage is triggered when an entity takes damage. It's often used to perform defense mechanisms after an entity has taken damage. When the entity is clicked is triggered when the entity is clicked. It's often used to click on an entity for dialogue or click to open a treasure chest. Note that to use this trigger, you need to check the entity clickable box in the entity properties. When the entity collides with other entity is triggered when the entity collides with another entity. It's often used when an entity collides with other entities, and then loses HP, knocked away, slowed down, etc. Note that this refers to collision by an entity. This will not trigger if it collides with a part. This example's effect is when a player suddenly quits in the middle of the game. A message is sent to other players to indicate that a player has left the game. Add when the entity leaves the game trigger node to the player entity. Drag the execution port of the action node. Click on Logic, then click on Flow Control, iterate over the array. In the Iterate over the array node, name the local variable as player. For the array parameter, select Obtain all players for entity. What these two steps mean is that the player's entities from each iterate are stored in the local variable player. Then drag the execution port of the action node below and select Display Tips in the interface section. In the Display Tips node, the entity parameter refers to the players. Drag the execution port of the entity parameter, and select Obtain local variable for variable. The variable name here is the player set in the Iterate over the array node. Drag the execution port of the content parameter, and select Combine String in Logic. The string1 parameter is set to obtain the entity's name for entity, followed by the entity that leaves the game. Fill the string2 parameter with exit. Set the display time parameter to 10. Now set up 2 players into the game, then click Run. After the game starts, let one of the player exit the game. You can see for the other player here a notice appeared. The example's effect is the monster entity collides with the player entity. The monster entity takes damage and loses HP. In the Game Components view, create a new entity template named Monster. If you want to change the models for the monster entity, the models can be purchased in the store. Then add the monster entity to the scene. Open the monster entity's trigger edit interface, and add the when the entity collides with other entity trigger node to the monster entity. Drag the execution port of the action node, and select the damage entity of the entity. In the damage entity node, the entity parameter is set to current entity in the current trigger parameters. The damage parameter is set to 2. The damage taken from parameter is set to other entity of the current trigger parameters. Now we completed the logic of reducing the HP of monster entity by 2 each time it collides. The example's effect is that after a player entity kills the monster entity, the player entity's HP is increased by 5. Open the trigger edit interface for the monster entity, and add the when the entity dies trigger node. Drag the action node's execution port, and select restore the entity's HP from entity. The entity parameter is set to killer for the current trigger parameters. The recovery parameter is set to 5. Finally, click Run, and you can see that for every monster entity killed by the player entity, the player's HP will be increased by 5. That's all for this video. We hope it can help you on your way to a great creator. If you want to know more about the editor, you can comment below the video or post on the official forum. See you in the next video.